Yeah, this is our new discovery session. We've got a star-studded lineup. We're starting off with Jim Shevock, who we've heard about in previous talks. Go figure. So Jim earned his master's in botany from CSU Long Beach and is retired from public service career with the Forest Service and the National Park Service. He's currently a research associate and fellow at the California Academy of Sciences and curator of Bryophytes. His current research and other work includes bryophyte inventories of the Klamath Range, distribution and ecology of rheophytic mosses, bryophytes of the southern Philippines, and training of bryological parataxonomists in developing countries. For his talk today, Jim will be describing the distribution and discovery of Northern California bryophytes. So please join me in welcoming Jim.
Well, welcome everybody. It's so great to see so many botanists in one place. For those of you who have not been to the Marble Mountain Wilderness, this is it. And now you can see why it's called the Marble Mountain Wilderness, even though that's the least amount of rock type in the wilderness is this marble. But there it is. The PCT cuts right across the base of that. But anyway, if you have not been there, you have to go to the marbles. It's spectacular. Well, let's get started. Well, I want to kind of tag on to what Ben said a little earlier. You know, when I was in my first botany class, I'm trying to remember about how much bryophyte lecture did I get. And I don't think I even had one. And probably most of you didn't have one either. But I want to kind of tag on to the importance of bryophytes. And I'm really glad that we've had the chance to have these sessions here. But first of all, we now know based on all of our molecular data that bryophytes make up 3/4 of the lineages of land plants, but they're quite different than the vascular plants. They're not just baby vascular plants, they're not primitive, they're not lower plants. They evolved a different way of being, and we just have to think about that. What they do on the landscape is so different, but their strategies have been very successful. So they're not really primitive, they're just different. And they've been around for 500 million years. So obviously very successful. And we just need to know more about them. So let's talk about some of the new things we found. Here we have Philanotis brutilioides. This is a fen species. It's actually quite widespread in California. I first collected this back in the 1980s, but I couldn't name it. And mainly because Philanotis is a big genus and it's taxonomically complicated. So no one wanted to name a new one. But we got some molecular data, and we were able to really solve the problem, and we called it brutilioides because it really looks like that genus. And it has many morphological features of Brutilia, that genus, which is not in California, but there's 8 species in Mexico. And so it looks like a Brutilia, but the molecular data says it's a Philanotis. So here's a picture of hillside fens in the marbles, which is very interesting because a lot of you have the snow melt and you have these beautiful fens hanging on the sides of the mountain. So it's not really flat. And you'll find this Philanotis all through these fens in the marbles, but it's also in the Sierra Nevada. Primarily, we thought it was an endemic to California, but Jason Brooks just recently found some populations up in southern Oregon in the Cascades. Now moving on to Grimmia. This is a fabulous genus. All the Grimmias are on rocks. They're not going to be on wood or soil. They want to be on rock. And there's about 90 species or so in the world, and we have over 1/3 of them in California, including several endemics. And they're pretty fascinating plants. They're going to be everywhere from Death Valley to the highest slopes of Mount Whitney. So they cover the complete gamut of elevation, plant communities. They're in every county in the state. Well, we got 2 new ones just recently described. And here's Grimmia insolita. And we found this first along the PCT in the Russian wilderness. And then we found another population in the Russian wilderness. So far we have 2 occurrences. So far it's restricted to granite rock. So it wants to be on that kind of rock type. So there's lots of potential habitat, for example, like in the Klamath or in the Trinity Alps, which we have a very, very poor record of bryophytes in that area. So hopefully we'll find some more of this. We've not found it in the marbles yet, but granite rock in the marbles is kind of limited, but we're still looking. And here's another one, just recently published as well. I first discovered this or encountered this in the Castle Craig's Wilderness area, maybe 6, 7 years ago, and then kept exploring through the Russian wilderness where it was actually fairly common, and it's in the marbles, and it's in the Siskiyou Wilderness too. So this is a species like the previous one. It wants to be right there in that subalpine zone where the suga grows. So once you get to the suga, and you start looking on the rocks, maybe you'll find this plant. It's very distinctive in the genus. It's the only one with these leaves that roll over, and then they twist like a corkscrew, and the plants will become quite dark, almost black by September or October. And after the first snow melt, they green up, and there you go. And this one, with the cross-section here with the costa, which is like the midrib of a moss, it's multi-celled at that point. And so the two parts here of the leaf kind of bend over and roll and then curl. So it's highly diagnostic. So you can find it on granite, metamorphics. I don't think I've seen it on marbles yet. But anyway, it's through that Suga zone. You get around 6,000 feet in the Klamath Range, you're going to come across this particular new species. So sometimes the new things we find aren't rare. We probably have about 15 to 25 occurrences of this in the marble wilderness alone, and in the Russians as well. And here's another Grimmia, known currently from one occurrence in Tehama County, but we don't know what this one is yet. And we're going to have to get some molecular data to figure it out, to see if it's something that was previously named long ago and sunk in synonymy, which is probably unlikely. But we have to rule out all the other Grimmia in the world to make sure that it is, in fact, something to be described. So it's going to be a little bit of a challenge. But that's one of the great things about bryophytes, is when you find something new out there, you think it's new, you start first looking at North America flora, and you say, is it any of those? And then you say, no, it's not there. Then you look at Mexico, and you keep expanding this search until you can finally eliminate all the continents. And then you say, okay, it's undescribed. And here's one that's a great, great story. This is a plant I've known about for about a decade. It's widespread throughout California. It's at least in 31 counties so far. And I would project it's probably in another dozen or two. It wants to be in intermittent stream channels or rivulets. So it's going to be wet during the winter months or during snowmelt, and then very soon it dries out. So this is in the Bryophytes, and this is also extremely common in John's study there at Henry Coe. And so it's green when it gets wet, and then as it starts to dry, it turns more of a straw color. The interesting thing is this has a vegetative structure called, it has rhizodal tubers. And this is the only group that these tubers are fan-shaped, flat, and they're kind of golden. And they're completely unknown in the family. So when we first saw this, thought, okay, we can name this. There's nothing else like this. But we couldn't figure out what genus to put it in. And so here's a great case where molecules and morphology tell different stories. If you just look at the morphology of the plant under the microscope, you'll say, oh, it belongs in the genus Plagiobryophytes. But you get the molecular data, and it says, no, it belongs in Ticostemum. So we're going to name it there. So we finally resolved that issue, so now we can move forward and name this plant. Well, even sometimes we get out in some really rural, dry areas, like the Great Basin, the Modoc Plateau, but there's new bryophytes to be found out there too. And here's one that Jason Brooks just found. He's just found it recently here in southern Oregon on the Klamath County. But recently I said, okay, Jason, now you got to just cross the border and find it in California. And sure enough, he did. And we have one occurrence. And if I can find it's right there. So it's about 1 square meter of California. And that's the other thing about bryophytes. They've been here a long time. a long, long time. They've weathered every climate change California has seen. And now some of them are just restricted to these small little isolated places, and it's for us to figure out where they are and find them. So some of these things can be thousands of miles away from the nearest occurrence. And this is a classic example of that. So you can see the size of those packets. So it's not a very large piece of chunk of ground. And you can see right here, it's kind of like a little rock recess. So it's a little bit more shaded, a little bit more cooler, because it gets pretty hot out there in the summertime. Well, here's the plant. It took me a couple of weeks to figure out what this was. So I got the specimen from Jason. The plant right there is about the size of your small thumbnail or fingernail. That's the whole plant. So you can see how small these leaves are. But the amazing thing about these leaves, which is different than all of our other North American Centrichia, we heard about Centrichia earlier this morning, this has a propagule here of gemmy, which is an asexual reproduction. And this just breaks off. It's very fragile. And there's hundreds of gemmy here, and each of those can form a new plant. So this particular thing is sexual. I've never seen a capsule on this ever. But the amazing thing is, this is new to North America. This particular species is from Chile, and here it is in California. So we have these disjuncts like this from other continents when the climate was different in California, but the bryophytes were here. And so it's not like we have to figure out these are like reintroductions or recent weedy things coming in. They've been here all the time. We just have to go out and find them. So here's some examples of just some of the more recent things that we found in California in the marbles. And 3 of those were actually found by Zane Walker. He's a student at Oregon State. He's gone out in the field with me collecting, and I sent him on a little backpack trip and said, okay, now you know how to collect bryophytes. Go out and collect them and bring them back, and we'll figure out what you got. So he comes back 2 weeks later. I get to see him on his hiking trip. He comes back with 3 new additions for California. Okay? So they're out there on a single trip. The amazing one here that I find is really fascinating is this Haplodontium. It looks identical morphologically to the species from the Himalayas. And so it's not mature sporophytes yet. We have to keep going back, hopefully to find them this coming summer, and get a molecular reading on it to see if it matches the sequences from those Himalayan plants. If so, that's going to be another unbelievable disjunct from the Himalayas to California. There's also a possibility that could be undescribed. Time will tell. As you can see, most of these come from the Cascades, but some even farther away from Alaska or whatever. So there's all kinds of really interesting distributions to find. And here's one of those that's really exciting. We have now 2 occurrences, both from the marble wilderness. This Asterella was known, nearest records were up in the Central Cascades. The interesting thing is these spores, that's the actual color. They're this pinkish, purplish color. And right here's the elators, and that's kind of like a bungee cord inside the capsule. And then it helps expand and contract and move the spores out. So if you look very carefully, you can see it's kind of this reddish purple tinge right here. That's where all the spores will come out. And the stalk here, the Coprocephala, is also fairly purplish. So that's unique and different from all the other Asterellas in California. But this species is subalpine. So you have to get up to about the Suga zone. So anything above 6,000 feet or so, rocky terraces, rock underhangs, that's where hopefully you can find more of this particular plant. So as Ben kind of mentioned earlier, we've found quite a few new things for California. You know, over 104 taxa, but the amazing thing is nearly a third of them are new to science. So that's a pretty high record of discovery coupled with them being new to science. So like I already mentioned, these aren't going to be new introductions. They've been here for millennia. It's just for us to figure out where they are and what microhabitats they're using. So where do we go? Where should we start looking for more bryophytes in California? Well, obviously some high priorities are areas that were ice age refugia. And the Marble Mountain Wilderness is one of those places. So just think about it. This one small little wilderness area on the Klamath Forest, and our projections now is that it will have 40% of all the bryophytes known for California in that single wilderness already. So that's another thing about bryophyte distributions from the vascular plants. We're looking for the vascular plants at very, very localized rare plant populations, but on bryophytes, we can have an occurrence, maybe only one or two in a whole county, and then the next occurrence could be 1,000 miles away. So there's always a chance for these things, number one, to occupy very, very small parts of the landscape. So you need to look for areas of unique geology, microhabitats, and places for studying, of course, would be wilderness areas are high priority because they're fairly well intact, some of the highest elevations in California, and they're just poorly known because you have to hike into them. You just can't drive your vehicle, stop, and collect along the road bank. So that's where a lot of these rarer things are being located off the beaten path. So I know a lot of you think, oh my God, I just can't study these bryophytes. They're too hard to learn. But there's not that many. And for any particular part in the state, you only have a dozen or so that are going to be super, super common for that location. And once you've learned those common species, the common ones in the coniferous forests, the common ones in the chaparral or the oak woodlands, then you look beyond those common ones to look for the species that can't survive in that common habitat type. You're looking for unusual substrates, unusual microhabitats. And that's where these disjunct kind of things are going to be found. And that's how your species list is going to grow. So you learn the dozen or 2 dozen things for your area, and then you look beyond those species to start hunting for the things that would occupy special places. And in California, your greatest species diversity is always going to be along riparian corridors because it's just going to be wet, it's cooler and damper, and that's what bryophytes like. And with that, I hope you all venture out and study more about bryophytes. Question for one? Time for questions. So if you have one, stand up.
The disjunct population in Chile, where in Chile was it?
Where in Chile
was it?
Oh, it's near the Patagonia area, very southern toward Punta Arenas, in that part of Chile. So it's kind of a different habitat when you think about it. That southern part of the tip of South America, and here on the Modoc Plateau. It's really kind of hard to explain.
I guess over your career, have you seen a different community composition of bryophytes in a post-disturbance regime, like post-fire, post-flooding?
Oh, yeah. Well, for example, like this new species of Ticostemum, it's a semi-rheophyte. It wants to be in water. So a lot of times during those flood periods, the sediment and the silt gets moved around, and those tubers get lodged, and they go downstream and find a new place to start and put into the population. So riparian areas, there's a lot of interesting bryophytes that have that disturbance regime. They want to be flooded on period times and then get reestablished. Same thing on the fires. You'll have a whole bunch of fire annuals that will pop up. They're not really annuals. They're in the spore bank, basically. After the fire, they germinate, and they'll be there for the first 4 or 5 years, and they'll just carpet. In some of the areas in the coniferous forest, you'll drive up there, and the understory will just be orange. And that's all mosses holding that soil in place. And then the vascular plants can now germinate because the bryophytes have kind of kept that soil moisture intact. So yeah, there's all kinds of things happening with disturbance.
So are they in bryophytes, the presence of bryophytes, are they indicative of a stable system or like a later species or later successional stage? Or does it vary?
I would say basically, when you see really dense bryophyte cover, you got a really healthy place because they are recycling water, nutrients, home for invertebrates. I mean, I'm in the tropics. If you're in a tropical forest and you don't see any bryophytes, something is terribly wrong. So everywhere you go in California, a really healthy place or riparian area, you're going to see bryophytes in the stream. You're going to see bryophytes on the rocks. If it's just barren, something's going on.
My question is, how do you tease apart true disjuncts from taxa that seem disjunct because of under-surveying?
Well, there are some lookalikes, just like on our vascular plants. So you have to just make a slide and do the comparisons, but the cellular arrangement is quite different, even though they vegetatively look identical. So you have to make a microscope slide at that time. I'm out of time, sorry.
Thanks, Jim.